Welcome to Scrubcast, where we explore clinical, translational, and health services research from Stanford University's Department of Surgery through conversations with the authors. I'm Rachel Baker. Today we're doing a special episode on Holman Day, our annual celebration of all things science honoring former department chair Dr. Emil F. Holman. This year's Holman Day was held on May 13th, and we were delighted to be joined by alumna Dr. Daniela Ladner as our keynote speaker. Holman Day also includes a poster and podium presentation competition for our trainees. Today, I'm joined by two of those winners. We're going to start with Dr. Jeff Choi, a resident in our general surgery program who's on the brink of finishing his professional development years. His winning podium presentation in the Clinical and Health Services Research category was titled, Tackling the Bedside Artificial Intelligence Barrier, Natural Language Processing to Extract Injury ICD-10 Diagnosis Codes, Real-Time from Electronic Medical Records. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Rachel. Happy to be here.
Awesome. So tell me, how did you first get interested in artificial intelligence?
I think I came across a couple articles about artificial intelligence and machine learning applications to medicine to improve patient care delivery as I was wrapping up my first master's degree. And I realized that, of course, Stanford was leading a lot of these efforts to integrate artificial intelligence within clinical decision making. The more and more I dug into it, I realized that this is something that I really would be excited to be a part of. I applied and was able to join the bioinformatics graduate program, and the rest is history from there.
That's right. You are getting your second master's degree this month?
Yes. Hopefully I passed all my courses this quarter. As long as I passed all my courses, I should have my degree this month.
Excellent. That's awesome. So I think one of the main takeaways for me from your presentation was about designing for the end user. Can you tell me a little bit about how you came to that conclusion?
That's such a great question, Rachel. I think there is a lot of interest in applying different machine learning algorithms or computer vision, different subfields within artificial intelligence to better improve patient care. But unfortunately, there is emerging evidence that despite the surging interest in these studies, very few machine learning or artificial intelligence-based models actually make it to the patient bedside. And even if they do, extremely few of them have actually shown to improve any outcomes, which really begs the question, if we're putting all this effort into designing high-performing models, we really want them to improve patient outcomes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some authors and really thought leaders have pointed out the fact that the reason for this gap between the publications and the bedside, this I call it the database to bedside gap,
Mm-hmm.
is because these studies don't really have, a lot of the studies don't have the end user in mind,
Mm-hmm.
in the sense that they don't really think about how the model could be implemented at the bedside. So that's where the whole discussion came into thought is, it's not an idea I came up with. It's an idea that's been going around the academic circle within machine learning literature for, the past few years now.
Nice. Well, so who is Bert, aside from Ernie's best friend on Sesame Street?
Yeah, no, that's exactly Bert I'm talking about. So BERT is an acronym which stands for Bidirectional Encoder Representation from Transformers.
I understand why
So
you call it Bert.
Yeah, so there's different types of BERT. You can essentially think about it as a type of an algorithm.
Mm-hmm.
And they have things like PubMed BERT. So this is a BERT model that was trained using the PubMed database.
Oh.
They have a bunch of other BERT models. So we call ours trauma BERT because it has to do with trauma ICD codes. So there's our trauma ICD BERT is one of, I don't know how many there are, but there are probably close to 100, if not more, of these something BERT models going around, and it's came out of specific natural language processing algorithm design.
Cool. And so with your Bert design, what did you create?
Sure. So essentially, the problem we're trying to tackle is the fact that we, as clinicians, we write a lot of notes that describe patient injuries. And specifically for trauma patients, we write these notes called trauma and tertiary surveys, which succinctly summarize the list of injuries that a patient has. The concern today is the fact that although we write a lot of these notes usually don't get converted into ICD-10 codes until about a month or so after a patient leaves the hospitals. And ICD-10 codes it's a language that allows researchers and billers to capture clinical information using a common vocabulary. So if you read up on essentially across any fields within medicine, a lot of them use ICD codes, and a lot of prediction tools that try to predict, patients' risk of mortality or adverse events, injury severity score, something that quantifies injury severity. A lot of these are based off of ICD-10 codes, but the problem today is that we're not able to use many of these tools real time while a patient is actually in the hospital because this translation from the English language that we type into the electronic medical record to the ICD-10 code language doesn't happen until after a patient leaves the hospital. So that's where trauma ICD comes in. It's trying to do that translation a lot more quickly right at the bedside.
Neat. Well, so you are a wonderful presenter. What tips do you have for giving a standout podium presentation?
Well, that's super kind of you. I'll start off by saying that I'm not a natural public speaker. I get very tachycardic when I stand in front of the audience still. And I don't think, I still have a long ways to go, but I do think I am better than where I was when I started my professional development time. And I owe a huge amount of thanks to Dr. Thomas Crummell, who gave a great presentation as a part of our professional development boot camp put on by the Aspire group. And he gave a fantastic talk on how to give a great presentation. And I think his slides are available online. The number one takeaway is practice, practice, and practice. So I believe the tip he gave was something on the order of, if you have a 1-minute talk, you need to prepare 20 or 30 times that amount. So if it's a 1-minute talk, you should prepare for 20 to 30 minutes. I think I'm still at about a 60x stage where if I'm giving a 10-minute talk, I think I probably put in about 10 hours of preparation to give that talk. And just the preparation has helped me deliver more polished presentations.
I love that you call it tachycardic. A surgeon won't be nervous. They're tachycardic. I love the inclusion of the QR code in your presentation. What led you to do that?
So I saw, again, like most things that I'm doing, a lot of these things were great ideas that someone else already came up with, and I just happened to see them. So I saw a tweet on Twitter from Dr. Elliot Hott at Johns Hopkins, and this tweet had a picture of a poster with a QR code that described the methods in depth. And his tweet was talking about how brilliant of an idea it is, because a lot of people, when they're looking at posters, are interested in the key takeaways and not necessarily in the line by line methodology. And as I was reflecting back on my own experience as a listener at conferences and presentations, at least for me, I realized that I really only remember a minority of presentations that I listened to. And for those, I only remember 1 or 2 key takeaways. And so when I realized this, I try to pay a little bit more attention to which parts of the presentations I was actually paying attention to. I realized that I really didn't pay that much attention to the methodology, in the sense that I paid a lot more attention to things like why the study was being done and what was the final result and what was the implications. But especially if it's in a field that I'm not familiar with, my mind sort of slipped as I was listening to the several methodology slides. So as a presenter, my goal was to keep the audience engaged in my presentation for the entire duration of my talk. And I thought, why not include a QR code to really go in depth into the methodology so that people who are interested can scan their QR code and read the detailed methodology either right then and there or after the talk for further questions. And this has happened. But and I would arguably say for the majority of the audience who are not too interested in the nitty gritty details, it would save them and me the effort of having to listen to me rambling about things that I probably are not that great explaining about.
Well, I think it's genius. It's a nice takeaway, especially when you're at something like Holman Day or a conference where you're listening to 16 presentations and maybe you're at the end of the day going through your notes and you think to yourself, gosh, I wish I knew more about blank.
I think this specific project gave me a lot of ideas to think more about how to implement my future studies. I think for the foreseeable futures, I'll work on building different machine learning based models. And for all of them, kind of the end goal is actually not to publish a paper in a great journal, but to actually build something that's going to improve patient lives or the patient providers' lives. And so based on some of the lessons that I've learned from this study, when it comes to the specific methodologic details or the way we plan to disseminate this paper and the tool, I think this will really serve as a foundation for a big part of my first years as an academic surgeon, and that will be how to build useful machine learning based models that can be readily implemented at the bedside. So this was really a foundational experience for me in terms of my overarching academic goals.
Awesome. That is so amazing to hear. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me, Rachel. I really appreciate your time.
Our next guest is Dr. Cynthia Kimura, a postdoc in the Division of General Surgery who came to us all the way from the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. Hi, Cynthia. Thanks for being on the show.
Hi, Rachel. Thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited to be able to talk about my research today.
Great. Well, how did you end up at Stanford?
Well, that's a long answer. So I moved to the US 2 years ago because of my husband's work. And I was looking for research positions here in the US. I had already finished my PhD that I did in Sao Paulo in Brazil. And I wanted to continue studying. So I had just published a paper on risk factors for complications in abdominal surgery for Crohn's disease. And in our study, we found out that patients who did preoperative optimization had the same risk of developing complications than patients who didn't do this optimization. Mostly because in Brazil, in São Paulo, in my service, a lot of our patients with Crohn's disease, they're really malnourished. So oftentimes you have to admit them to the hospital a couple of weeks before surgery to optimize their nutrition and do physical therapy, blood transfusions, and things like that. So it was very interesting that we could, get these patients who are so high risk to having the same risk of, other Crohn's disease patients who weren't so malnourished. So I knew I wanted to go beyond that and study some strategies to decrease the risk of surgical complications even more. But I wasn't really sure what project I wanted to be part of. And then it came this opportunity to work with Dr. Kim at Stanford as a postdoc. And I was really fascinated by how innovative her work was on prehabilitation. I wasn't even familiar with the word prehabilitation at the time. So I think when I got to understand what it meant, then I realized it was the perfect thing for me to to research. So yeah,
awesome.
that's my story.
I totally see the connection. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and it was a coincidence because like at the same time that I published this paper, she had published another paper on patients with inflammatory bowel diseases. So that's how I came across her name, and everything worked out so perfectly.
Serendipity, perfect.
Yeah.
I watched your presentation on YouTube, and it's titled Effect of an Online Home-Based Prehabilitation Program on Outcomes After Colorectal Surgery.
Yeah.
And it looked to me like the data is clearly showing the prehab is working.
Yeah, I think we're going in the right direction.
Great. So I guess what struck me, though, was when you discussed the people who didn't enroll in the program. How are you planning to modify future studies to control for that?
Yeah, so right now in our study on prehabilitation, we are randomizing patients to either receive prehabilitation through an app or to just, receive some very basic recommendations on what they should do. Like you should just walk 3 times per week and do some strength exercises as you wish. And so for the patients who are in the intervention arm, we're checking in with them every week to make sure that they are doing the exercises and following the diet. If they have any doubt, we do track their activity with a wearable device as well, so we can monitor it. So every week we log in and see how many steps they're walking per day. And so this is a way that we're trying to improve adherence to prehabilitation in the intervention arm.
Awesome. What about the people who are perhaps are already fit, and so that's why they're capable of doing the program and doing so well? Is that something that you're worried about?
Yeah, definitely, because this could be, a very important confounding. So one thing in this study that I presented at Holman Day, one thing that we're worried about is that maybe those patients who adhere to prehabilitation, they were already active before the program. So it was not actually the program who improved their outcomes. It was, things that they were doing before as a part of their lifestyle. So for this study now, we're trying to evaluate the baseline level of activity of the patients. So we asked them to do some tests to see how far they can walk in 6 minutes, for example, and what are their functional status. So we can control for that in future analysis.
Awesome. Well, so poster presenting to me seems to be an art unto itself. What tips do you have for giving a great poster presentation?
Rehearse. I think is the only tip that I can give. I mean, it's hard because the amount of time that we have to present is so short.
Right.
And we have to really pick what is most important about this study.
Same with the actual poster itself, the physical poster. It's how do you decide what goes on? It's such a limited space.
Yeah, I think whenever I have to make a poster, I think it's worse than making an entire podium presentation because it's a lot more work to, condense everything. But one thing that I learned is, to try not to make it so cluttered. So try to use images, icons to summarize important concepts so you don't have a lot of words. And also try to be really mindful about what kind of information you're putting on tables, because tables can be very hard to read in a poster, especially with the tiny numbers. So I think that is something that everyone should have in mind as well.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Well, you mentioned a little bit about future studies and where you're going. Can you tell us a bit about the project you're currently working on?
Yeah, sure. So there are 2 projects that I'm working on. One is this randomized clinical trial on prehabilitation, where we're randomizing patients to either receive an app-based prehabilitation or nothing, standard or just standard of care. And the other big project that I'm working on is about how diet can affect your microbiome and how that could affect your surgical outcomes in colorectal surgery. So in this other study, we're randomizing patients to different diets to see prior to surgery to see if this short-term dietary intervention can change their microbiome profile and if that could, translate into better outcomes after surgery.
Cool.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Is one diet all kimchi, fermented foods, and
yeah, it's not all kimchi, but it is a lot. We're asking patients to eat 6 servings of probiotic foods, fermented foods, or eat a lot of fiber, or just keep with their normal diet.
Cool. Well, I can't wait to see it. Thank you so much for coming on the show today and sharing your story.
Okay, thank you so much for having me.
And to all our listeners, thank you for tuning in. These presentations and all of the research presented at Holman Day can be found on our YouTube channel. A link is available in the description. We want to hear what you think of Scrubcast. You can email us at scrubcast@stanford.edu or hit us up on Twitter @StanfordSurgery. If you like Scrubcast, please share it with your friends. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if you really like us, smash that 5-star review. Scrubcast is a production of Stanford University's Department of Surgery. Today's episode was produced by Rachel Baker. The music is by Midnight Rounds. And our chair is Dr. Mary Hahn.